Hi, everybody. My name is Will Anders. I'm the president and board chair here at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. And it's a pleasure to have with us today Felipe Seligman. He's a journalist by training, who also received an MBA from MIT. Felipe founded JOTA close to 12 years ago with the goal of being an informative powerhouse that gives transparency to public information, provides greater legal security to the market, and transforms society through specialized, technical, impartial, and nimble journalism, something that we all need. He's a good friend and frequent speaker here at the Chamber, and we're excited to have this conversation with him for our sixth BrazilCham Talks podcast. Felipe, welcome to the podcast. 2026 is going to be a busy year for markets, for investors, especially for those who, like you, are charged to attempt to interpret what is going on in Brazil and in the world. Let's start with Brazil, and then we can expand to the U.S. later on. Can you give us a big picture of what is going on with Brazil's institutions today?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, Will Anders. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We've been interacting for many years right now, always talking about Brazil and the investment landscape in there. So it's a very pleasure to be here to talk about Brazil once more. And thank you for the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to participate. So hope we can have a good chat. And let's go directly to your question. So I believe that we are, of course, we cannot deny that it's a special year. It's an election year. It's the last year of the third term of Lula as president of Brazil, and everybody's asking basically what's going on in Brazil in terms of the institutional relationships. We are, as in many other countries in the world, living in a very polarized society. And the dynamics, of course, of this polarization affects the way that the institutions work. So in the Congress, we see as a party or a strength in their ability to rule after many years that they were basically hostages of the agenda of the executive branch. We see an executive branch that is not very powerful in terms of leading the agenda. First, because now with this dynamics in which more or less 1/3 of the discretionary budget of Brazil is in the hands of the parliament, they don't have a lot of coins to offer in order to get their agenda the priority they need, but also because we are dealing in a situation in which Brazilian president is doesn't have majority. So and if you analyze the last presidents, of course, in Brazil, you never have an absurd majority, but you always have more or less 50%. You don't have the quorum to approve a constitutional amendment, but you have enough historically to push the not constitutional bills and other discussions, and this is not what is happening here in Brazil. So if you analyze the support part of the parliament, the part of the parliament that support Lula, we are talking about like 1/3 of the parliament. We're talking in the chamber, in the lower chamber, more or less 120, 130, and you have 513 House representatives. So his support is really, really small. It's a very thin margin. So he needs to basically compose. And the problem is that Lula present himself as a center-left president, but the Congress profile is more center-right to right. So the distance, the ideological distance between Lula and the parliament is the biggest ever, basically. So it makes more difficult to create this majority needed. So he needs to pick very carefully the themes that he wants to go through the parliament, and knowing that the themes more ideological will have more difficult time or eventually won't be able to be discussed in the parliament. And at the same time, we see the Supreme Court very important in order to equalize this attachment between what the government wants and what the Congress wants. So if you analyze how the Supreme Court acts, basically helps a lot Lula to push his agenda through institutional decisions through constitutional decisions from the Supreme Court. In terms of the pork barrel discussions, in terms of some of the more leftist agendas that comes from the Supreme Court, which makes the Supreme Court a target of the polarization as well. We've seen a Supreme Court that is basically, there's a part of Brazil that doesn't see it as an institution that has representativity. So it's very there's an important part of the population that is very against the Supreme Court, but there's another part of the population, also big, that thinks that the Supreme Court was very important to save the Brazilian democracy at the end of Bolsonaro's government and in the beginning of Lula's government, the January 8th that happened here in Brazil. So it's also like one of the themes of the polarization in Brazil. And what's going on right now is that there is this dysfunctionality of the institutions, somehow an equilibrium that everybody helps everybody, and we don't lose track. We keep organizing our politics in a way that works for everybody, because any change can bring a total disbalance of the system. So it's balanced in that dysfunctionality, but it's very balanced. So the government is delivering what they need. The parliament is approving a lot of constitutional changes. So it's kind of counterintuitive, because when I describe a situation that probably in a country more like normal, it will be impossible to govern, or in a parliamentarist system, it will be impossible for Lula to rule. But somehow in Brazil, we arrive in 2026 with an election. He is a president. He will be the candidate. He's one of the favorites. So this is kind of counterintuitive, and maybe can be explained by these different ways that the institutions they act, not exactly how you would expect in theory, but in practice they act because they balance each other in a way. We have other things, less structural and more, I would say, more linked with highlights and themes like corruption that we can talk later, but because it's very important also to explain the current situation. But I would say that the big picture of what's going on right now in Brazil is more or less that. Hope I answered the first question.
No, I think just a quick follow-up on that, because if you read a lot of different reports and all that, there's always that question of, is the judiciary too strong right now, or is the legislative, is the Congress really dominating the agenda, and the president has lost power? But it sounds like you're saying that we don't have a disequilibrium. Like actually, the three powers are kind of working the way it's supposed to work, and they're keeping each other in check. Would you agree with that?
So I believe that it's a little bit of both. So the first thing is that there is this regulation in a way that the judiciary is strong and somehow affects the political discussions and participate in a way that you wouldn't expect a Supreme Court to participate. This is for sure a total truth. But how can we explain that? So the Brazilian Constitution was made in 1988, and it's a very big constitution. So that's the first thing. So a lot of things that in other countries they are not ruled by a constitution, in Brazil they are ruled by the constitution. So this is one thing. One thing that changed in the constitution of 1988 is that also the representatives that wrote the bill, the constitutional bill, they decided to open the doors of the Supreme Court to a lot of institutions. So if you have national representation, like if you are the bar association, if you are a commerce association with national representation, if you are a political party with one member in the Congress, you can propose unconstitutionality cases at the Supreme Court. And different than the US, for instance, the Supreme Court cannot say no. So there's not a pre-analysis of if that is something that the Supreme Court can analyze or not. If arrives there, they will need to analyze. So so why I say that somehow this is a consequence of this balancing of the power, because when we have a polarized society, that the main discussions cannot be solved politically inside the parliament, which is the place that naturally should be discussing that, and any of the parties that loses a case in the parliament can bring that case to the Supreme Court. You politicize the Supreme Court. You bring the Supreme Court to solve the political issues that, in theory, the Supreme Court shouldn't be discussing, because this is something that the parliament wants. But who brings the cases to be solved in the parliament is the Supreme Court. What happened in the past 30 years, 25 years? First of all, the polarization made those parties to bring everything. So that started during the government Fernando Henrique. That increased during the first and second term of Lula. That increased even more with the Dilma's situation, because of the impeachment, because of the inability to deal with the Congress and the impeachment process, and because they couldn't solve their issues by themselves. The Supreme Court started to have this important role in the main discussion: tax, gay marriage, everything that you can imagine goes to the Supreme Court because cannot be solved in the parliament. This is one thing. The other thing was a decision that's I really question if it was the best decision ever made, to create a live television to broadcast the Supreme Court deliberation. So different than almost every country in the world, the Supreme Court justices, they are broadcast live when they are deciding, when they are discussing, when they are fighting, when they are talking. So they became public figures in Brazil. That, together with this power and mixed with this inability to solve issues because of the polarization, create this huge Supreme Court in Brazil. And it was a huge Supreme Court that has a good part, because of course it's easier to solve the issues if you need 1, 2, 3, 4 votes. It's easier to get majority when you have 11 justices, and Lula, I would say that directly or indirectly, pointed 8 of them or 7 of them. So it's easier to imagine, at least to have theoretically, the idea that I don't need to solve things in the parliament because it goes to the Supreme Court. But this is starting to get messy. The questioning, the part of the population that are critical about the Supreme Court is getting, I would say, less patient. It's basically preaching about like more accountability for the justices of the Supreme Court. And now we are in the middle of a mess, because there is an investigation with a bank here in Brazil that somehow involves justice, 1 or 2 justices of the Supreme Court, which in my opinion makes the Supreme Court weaker. So they are very powerful. They have less accountability than the other branches of the power, even though everything they do is broadcast live. So whenever you question them about their accountability, they say there's no other institution that broadcasts every decision live, every discussion live, every deliberation live. So, but when you have one police investigation, one criminal investigation against one that involves directly or indirectly a member of the Brazilian Supreme Court, it affects the image of the Supreme Court. And that's why now there's the president, the current president of the Supreme Court is trying to approve a bill or an agreement between the peers to, I would say, like a code of ethics code, which some people say that is basically not needed because you have criminal laws, you have other laws. They say, like, we don't need to create something special for us because we should be accountable to those laws that already exist. But others says, look, we need to give the example. We need to approve some rules that we're gonna follow internally. And there's a lot going on. Now, I think this is a Friday. We are discussing this in a day that there's a meeting going on right now to discuss the situation because they're worried about, not about the case itself, but about how this can affect the image of the Supreme Court, and in affecting the image of the Supreme Court, how can affect the role of the Supreme Court in the Brazilian society. So it's what's going on in the Supreme Court currently.
And last question on the Supreme Court for me. Are there any other rules being talked about to change? So that, for example, like you said, they have to decide on every case. They can't pass. Is there any talks about changing those aspects to make it more efficient? Because right now you have thousands of cases that are stuck there forever, never get a decision. And it's humanly impossible to decide on so many cases, right? And so are there any talks about that?
Yeah, so have been some changes in the past few years because it was like very difficult as accumulation of cases and process and in the Supreme Court. They changed something. So the first thing that they approved past 10 to 15 years was like some rules that says, look, when the Supreme Court decide an appeal that is not valid for actions of inconstitutionalities. We call it here ADINs, ação direta de inconstitucionalidade. But these actions, yeah, you should propose and you're gonna rule it and it's valid for everybody. But until 2010, each appealing case that arrived in the Supreme Court were analyzed individually, and it would only affect that cases. By 2010, a little bit earlier than that, like 2008, 2009, they created another thing saying, now in terms of appeal, they only will rule appeals that have a general repercussion in the Brazilian society. So now there's a line of cases that they need to analyze if that appeal has a general repercussion. If not, they cannot. They can basically say that they won't rule it because it only affects those specific cases, and they won't analyze. In that term, helped the Supreme Court, but the problem is that when the Supreme Court says that an appeal that arrived at the Supreme Court has general repercussion, all the cases related in the whole justice system of Brazil get freezed until the Supreme Court decides, which would be very good if the Supreme Court could decide that like in months. But sometimes they basically said, look, this has general repercussion, and it takes like years to rule. So this is something that they are trying to deal with. The other thing that the changes is that they could give like subpoenas and decisions that were individually, and now they are putting some like, if there is a decision that is individual, there is one justice, he needs to put to vote immediately. So that was a change. And if also they can also paralyze the case to analyze better, so they can basically say, look, I need more time to analyze that. Before, like 5 years ago, 3 years ago, there was no time. He could spend like years analyzing that case that the specific judge paralyzed, and nobody would question that. Now, after 90 days, if he doesn't have a vote or a case, the case goes back to the schedule, to the Supreme Court plenary. So things that they are trying to do to fix that. And more important than that, I believe that they also created the virtual plenaria, the virtual court, where they can solve cases. So they only bring to the broadcast session those really popular themes. A lot of other teams that would go to this sessions now they are not going. So they go to a virtual court where they decide electronically. They don't need to discuss. And it's more fast. So they are thinking and implementing fast tracks in order to get more cases to be judged, but still it's not enough. It's always a political decision to finalize or to bring a case to vote and so on. But I believe that this is something that happens in any Supreme Court in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Maybe we should switch the topic a little bit and talk about elections. Obviously, everybody wants to know what's going to happen in 2026, not only in Brazil, but in the United States too. We have presidential elections and congressional elections in the in Brazil. We have the midterm elections here in the U.S. How would you compare and contrast the two elections, Brazil versus the United States? President Trump's positioning here in the U.S. versus President Lula's positioning in Brazil, popularity and unpopularity. Um, how would you compare the two?
So there are a lot of similarities in terms of the dynamics of the country. I think that exactly like Brazil, in the U.S. Also we are dealing with a very divided country. So now we don't vote to a project or to ideas that we believe. There's not a dispute of a vision of a country. It's more linked with rejection. And I believe that rejection here in Brazil is what makes the election very, very tight in terms of Lula and the son of Jair Bolsonaro, Flávio Bolsonaro. And I believe that is more or less the same in the US, at least what I follow. Like as the Democratic Party doesn't present themselves as a party that can lead the US in this moment, the transformative moment, it's easier to Trump to present himself as a better alternative for those that reject the Democratic Party. And also, a lot of people that usually had the historical appreciation of the Republican Party ideas, they somehow don't identify themselves to Trump's agenda. So there's a complication in terms of the rejection feeling. So this is never good because this amplifies the polarization. And in Brazil is the same. So here in Brazil, Lula has a ceiling very low, so a rejection very high, and has a support high. Well, he has a floor very high. Jair Bolsonaro, and it's linked with this idea. It's high, but it's not as high as he used to be of his support. So, but the ceiling is very low. Flávio Bolsonaro is the same. The floor is very high, and the ceiling is very low. So it's a dispute of rejection. Whoever has the ability to convince the Brazil that they are the least worst alternative for the Brazilians will win the election. We have a population that is tired of the polarization. They wish it had a third way or a third name, but they don't identify with anyone because the problem is that there's no alternative. And I believe that Lula, in this moment, is a favorite because he has the agenda in his hand. He found a narrative path that helps him to convince the Brazilian population that he's the best pick for the majority, more importantly, for the poor people of Brazil. And we have the center-right spectrum of the Brazilian politics very fragmented. So you have the Bolsonaro family trying to find ways to survive politically and also criminally and so on. Jair Bolsonaro is in jail right now. You have a part of the center right trying to find a way to become more relevant, even though they are not very relevant. They don't have the votes They have the structure, they have the political, they have the institutionality, but they don't have the vote. And you have Lula by himself, the only representative of the center left and the left. So it makes him like very. It makes it easier for Lula to present himself with an agenda. His agenda right now is basically giving more power to the Brazilian poor population and low middle class, trying to like help them with exemption of the income tax, giving them like distributing for free gas, propane, um, uh, basically also abating like the lightning bill for free for more than 80 million people. So he's trying to help the Brazilian population to feel that they have more purchasing power right now. This is the way. How he presents himself, he says, who will pay this bill? The big rich people. We call it here the BBB in Brazil. It's the billionaires, the banks, and the bets. The bets. So he says, look, who's paying the bill is the BBB, and they need to pay the bill because you guys need to spend. But it's something interesting. It's a dynamics that doesn't work that much because in terms of the fiscal policies, it gets very, very difficult to control and to find an equilibrium. Uh, this week that we are recording this podcast, Galípolo, the president of a central bank, said something that was very interesting. He said, like, of course, the interest rates in Brazil are very high. We're talking about 15%, the Selic. And he said, you shouldn't ask me why the interest rate is so high. You should ask me, the right question to ask is, being so high, why we cannot control the inflation? So he said that in a conference this week, and I think that this is something that Lula or Flávio Bolsonaro or whoever who wins the election will face in the next term of Brazilian election.
And when we think about the elector, you mentioned corruption earlier on the call in the podcast. Now you talk about interest rates, which obviously impact people's ability to borrow and consumption. And you talk about popularity of or rejection rates for the two main candidates. Uh, and in a way, you also mentioned a third candidate. I mean, we've heard a lot about this golden group of governors that are now finishing their terms, well, except for one, who could potentially be a third candidate. What's more
Yeah.
important for the electorate today? What are they focused on the most? Uh, and I mean, you kind of answered it, but what's more important for them today? And what are going to be the main topics for discussion once we know for sure who the candidates are?
Yeah. So I believe that the first thing is economy. I think Brazil is still the inflation and all these topics. They are still very important in terms of deciding whoever will win the election. I still believe that the incumbent here in Brazil are still very favorites. I truly believe that Lula didn't win the election in 2022. Bolsonaro lost it because of mistakes that he made. So it's not a problem of incumbents. I know that there are a lot of incumbents around the world that are losing because of the impact of social media and other stuff. And I still believe that the being an incumbent in Brazil, with the presence of so many social programs, are still very important. People don't want to lose it, and if they find it that there is a threat of losing those social programs, they would eventually reject anyone that is not the incumbent. That was valid to Bolsonaro, is valid for Lula right now. The corruption might be a theme. It will be a discussion that will permanently occupy the media discussion throughout the year because it's only the beginning of the case involving the Banco Master. And it's not very good for Lula because, of course, whenever you talk about corruption in Brazil, you still link that, mistakenly or not, with the PT past government, with the Lava Jato and so on. So they are very worried about that. There are some people that want to be very far away from that discussion, trying not to be linked and so on. There are others that see it as an opportunity, like other people from the government, like Fernando Haddad, the finance minister. He's been defending that the PT should position themselves in order to support the investigations, because it's an opportunity to detach the PT and corruption. This is one side, but this is another side that part of the population, doesn't matter if Lula is linked or not, doesn't matter. They see a corruption. It's during the government of Lula, it's during PT, it might harm Lula electorate. So this is a theme. And then you have this idea of this group, the golden group of governors, that was built by Gilberto Kassab, the president of the PSD, a brilliant politician in Brazil. He's a very good political analyst and so on, that positions himself as the center. Basically, he said, look, I am an alternative for those that are tired of the polarization. The problem is that still none of those three candidates they're nationally known. So they're very unknown. And it's difficult whenever because everybody only talks about things that polarizes. Whenever you present yourself as, I don't want to discuss polarization, I don't want to be part of that, you lose the share of voice in the political arena. So it's a kind of a contradiction, because people are tired, but they don't want to leave the arena. So by now, I believe that they are a strong group that will be very decisive during the election. They are not the favorites. I would say that even to be in the runoff, because for sure Lula won't win. Not for sure, but I would say like more than 90% of chance that Lula doesn't win in the first round. You talk about the way they are positioned themselves, so they probably know that they won't be in the second round in the runout, but they will be very decisive in terms of support. And if there's something that happened, if there's something that we don't know, usually in Brazil, there's a lot of things that happen that we don't know in the election year. What can happen is that they will be very well positioned to go to the direct dispute against Lula or against Flavio, and they have a good chance to win because the polarization won't exist anymore. It's not the base case scenario, but it's a good way also to Gilberto Kassab to be the guy that everybody wants them to end. So he can support Flavio if he feels that the winds are more to the right. He can support Lula if he feels that the winds can go more to the left. And this is Kassab in essence, like being well positioned to support whoever gonna win, or even winning if one of those parts are faced with something that is unpredictable and bad for them. So I believe that this is the main context, talking about corruption, talking about economy, and about this new group that was formed a few weeks ago.
A lot of people listening to this podcast are very interested in what's going to happen with interest rates in Brazil. At 15% real rate, around 7, 8, one of the highest in the world, and still producing decent GDP numbers, still producing decent unemployment numbers. So it doesn't seem to be hurting the economy overall. I'm sure there are sectors that are hurting quite a bit. And it's got to be also polarizing that effect. But if the government is looking to spend more because it's an election year, and there's this great expectation in the market that we're going to have somewhere between 150 and 300 basis points. I think that's the highest number I've seen in cuts during the year because inflation is somewhat under control. Uh, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, Galipo went in there when there was a lot of pressure on the central bank. Oh, they're keeping rates too high. They're destroying the economy. And he hasn't been able to change anything yet because of the issues you just mentioned. What should we expect on that front?
So I believe that the market consensus that we're gonna see like a small drop in the rate, but I don't see some like a very significant drop. So it all depends of how the next government will present themselves in terms of fiscal policy. So we're gonna see marginal drops, like 0.25 now, 0.25. I don't see like a more structural drop because of that, because the way that the fiscal framework is built in a way that you can basically allow the government to spend whenever they want. There's a lot of also parafiscal rules that they are building in terms of guaranteeing those more social policy that doesn't go to the primary surplus account, but goes to has a direct impact in the Brazilian national debt. And this, of course, affects the ability of the central bank to drop the rates. So I believe that we're gonna see marginal drops, and waiting until we understand what the next president, either Lula or Flávio, will do. I always believe that you need to never expect that will be like Lula. If he wins, he will like go to a more ideological, heterodox fiscal policy, because he's very pragmatical. He will analyze that. Of course, you also cannot expect a huge cut in the Brazilian public expenses. So this is not Lula, but he's pragmatical. He'll do whatever he needs to do to organize that. So to at least to deliver some good results. It will be his last term. He doesn't need to worry about his re-election. He won't be able to be re-elected anymore. He can be more pragmatic. He can solve some situations in order to guarantee a better situation in the medium and long term. He can be less narrow focused on the short term and maybe think about the future. Here I'm trying to be positive about Lula. It's not the base case scenario, and you also cannot expect that either Flávio, Tarcísio, Caiado, Ratinho to be very fiscal,
Conservative.
conservative, because they need to deal with the Congress. They need to the Congress wants to spend as well. We cannot forget that they have 1/3 of the discretionary budget. They want to spend. If you're spending more, they are spending more. If they are spending more, they have more money to present to their voters. So they are not 100% conservative in that way, and they need to be worried about their re-election. So if they are president, even though they are representatives of so you never can exactly expect. Of course, signals will be better if there is someone that is not Lula, for the market at least, and Lula signals like bad news for markets sometimes, but that does not mean that what they will do, it will be exactly what they say. So for bad and for worst.
Felipe, we're coming up to our time here. Any final thoughts from you? I was going to ask you a question about how do we end polarization, but we'll leave that for another talk, because I think that's more than a 2-minute response. But any final thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, I believe that we are in a. First of all, thank you so much, and sorry about my bad English. Once someone told me when I try to talk in English or give interview or participate in a panel, that the most spoken language in the world is bad English. So I feel very comfortable because I can communicate myself. So, but first of all, sorry about that. The second thing is I believe that we are living in a world in transition. So everything is changing. The way we interact with technology is changing. The way we interact with politics is changing. And in Brazil, the way we see the politics will change dramatically in the next 4 to 5 years. If Lula wins, is his last term. If Lula loses, is his last term. So we will see new leadership in Brazil. We will see new discussions in Brazil. And of course, I cannot say that this is the end of polarization, but is at least the beginning of a new possibility of polarization. And we are dealing with two very strong candidates like Lula and Bolsonaro. They are social leaders. They are like popular leaders that we don't see very often in Brazil. And both of them won't be able to participate in the next term. So we will see an election after so many years without Lula, without Bolsonaro into 2030. And we're going to see what happens. So there's a world that is changing dramatically and new leadership that will emerge in that scenario.
Felipe, thank you so much. Felipe Seligman, co-founder here of JOTA. Great presentation, great conversation. Sounds like we're going to have you back again a couple more times this year because it's going to be a very busy year on the political side. But on behalf of the Chamber, I want to thank you very much for participating in this podcast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thank you so much.